You can tell that football's back because we're back to having abominations on Thursday nights. And really, I would be open to hear what sort of argument there exists for the Giants to win, especially with Saquon Barkley being hurt. I don't really see how they can win this game. It's in San Francisco. The Niners have the better team, and so far, Purdy has been the better quarterback as well. So I feel pretty safe in saying the Niners are going to win. Green Bay and New Orleans is actually a very solid game, and I've kind of went back and forth on it because there are some supporting arguments for the Saints, but in the end, I'm going with the Packers because they have the better offensive line, that is for sure, and I actually think the weapons are pretty similar as well because Christian Watson, if he plays, is a great weapon, and I don't think he's quite the caliber of Chris Olave, but I think he's similar. And then just down the line, it's also pretty similar because Alvin Kamara would really be an X factor in this game. He would be the weapon that kind of sets this in favor of the Saints. But right now, the running backs are definitely in favor of the Packers with Aaron Jones, assuming he's going to play as well, which looks like this is going to be the case. And again, you have the better offensive line. So there's a lot of things that work in the favor of the Packers. Not the least of which, too, is the fact that Jordan Love gives you a much, much higher upside than Derek Carr does, even if Derek Carr gives you a little bit of a better baseline. If this game ends up being a shootout, which would be pretty surprising, I think both teams have good defenses, but if it ends up being high scoring, I'm going to trust Love a bit more than I will Carr because Love has looked pretty sharp so far, and I think he looks the part to be a quarterback you can rely on. Speaking of good matchups, this Chargers and Vikings matchup is got to be one of the best 0-2 versus 0-2 teams of all time because I think both of these teams still have the potential to be playoff contending teams, and I don't think that's too hot of a take, actually. I think most of us expected the Chargers to be, and the Vikings were a playoff team as recently as last year, so it's not too out of the realm of possibilities for them to both make it again. They're just going to both have to turn it around really quickly, and that's going to especially be the case for the Vikings because I think they're going to fall to 0-3, which might just be too much to come back from, but the NFC is pretty weak, and the NFC North in particular is ripe for the pickings, so there's still some hope for the Vikings. Why I like the Chargers, though, I think Kirk has played about as well as any quarterback has to this point of the season. He has put up some really nice numbers, but I think Justin Herbert is right there with him, and I think really it's just going to be a matter of can the Chargers play some resemblance of defense? If so, I think this is their game, and I think there's just too much talent on their team for them to not play some competent level of defense. I'm not saying it has to be great, but between Bosa and Mack and some really talented back-end players as well, they have the makings of a really good defense. It's just probably coaching as the biggest issue for the Chargers, which has been an issue for several years at this point, but I think they're going to be able to contain the Vikings a little bit. And I don't know if the Vikings are going to have any success containing the Chargers because you have Herbert, you have 4 legitimate receiving wide receivers, and then you have a tight end, and I'm not sure if Eckler's playing. I don't think he's listed as doubtful anymore, but he didn't practice Wednesday, so that remains up in the air. Either way, I think it's more so a case where they could use Eckler, but they're not going to fall apart without him either. This Titans-Browns matchup is so ugly, and it's going to reminisce a lot of the thoughts we had watching the Browns-Steelers game, except I think it's only going to be magnified because the Titans have a better run defense than the Steelers do, and that's not really a dig on the Steelers. The Steelers are without Cam Hayward, one of their best players. And in addition to that, the Titans just have an exceptional run defense as well. So what that means is Watson's going to be forced to throw, and he's going to be forced to throw probably more than he was against the Steelers because the Browns are able to run all over the Steelers. They're not going to just be able to run against the Titans. And really, Tannehill has not looked good this year, and he has never really been an elite guy, but I have a lot more faith in him than I do Watson at the moment because Watson, for a year and about a half now, or I guess half of last season and then all of this season to this point, I should say, has looked like he can't throw the football. And one, I find that great. The sexual predator is really struggling on the field, but it's really scary, I think, if you're a Browns fan, because you take away the run, what are you going to do beyond that now? That's up in the air for the Browns. And I have more faith, again, in Tannehill being able to throw a little bit because I think the Browns are going to be able to stop Tannehill from just handing the ball off as well. But you have a little more faith in Tannehill at this point than Watson. So I think this is a bad matchup for the Browns. And I think the Titans getting 3.5 points, that's worthy of putting a unit on because that's over the threshold of 3. If this is a field goal game, it's still a win for the Titans. I think this is going to be a field goal game. Detroit and Atlanta is a very solid game, and I'm leaning Detroit on it because I think, for one, Goff is just a better quarterback than Desmond Ridder. But as Atlanta has shown to this point, they don't need Ridder to be great to win because they have a lot of other pieces in place, especially just with how much talent they have on the offensive side of the ball, even if they're not necessarily coaching that out the best, with Kyle Pitts being kind of minimized and Drake London not always being utilized either. Regardless, they have a lot of talent. I just think that Detroit is better able to stop Atlanta's talent than Atlanta is to stop Detroit's because Amon-Ra St. Brown, I don't see anyone on Atlanta being able to stop him or really even containing him, really. And I think Detroit has a number of players they can put on Drake London defensively, which I think it's going to be kind of more of a by committee stopping of him than it will be just one corner. I think Sutton's going to be on him part of the time. Sutton might be a little bit too small, though. He's going to be replaced with Mosley other parts of the game. So there's going to be a lot of people they can throw at London to slow him down. And Kyle Pitts, you just need the coaching to not remember that he's a part of the team, and that'll do a good job of defending him, really. So it's going to be a question, basically, of if Detroit can slow down the running game of the Falcons, which is not an easy task. Bijan Robinson looks like the rookie of the year on the offensive side of the ball so far, but I think Detroit is a little bit better of a run defense than there may be thought of. They haven't had great statistics to this point, but they have Aiden Hutchinson, who's a great edge run defender, and their interior is not as squishy as it once was either. So I think they have the makings of being able to defend the run. I'm going to keep this one short and sweet. The Bills are going to be just fine against the Commanders. The Commanders, they pose some threat on every single team just because their defensive line can really get after you. But I think Josh Allen is going to be able to survive against it and also just not throw too many boneheaded interceptions or do too many crazy fumbles, in which case I think the Bills are going to be just okay. As far as Miami and Denver goes, I have a ton of respect for Patrick Surtain, but I don't think anybody's stopping Tyreek Hill one-on-one, and that's also true for Jalen Waddle as well, where you're going to need to shade some extra coverage towards both of these players, and it's just impossible to do to both of them and not just allow Braxton Berrios to be completely unguarded. So I think the Dolphins are basically unstoppable at this point offensively, and there's just not really a way to slow them down with just one corner. You're going to need elite corners all over the place to really contend with this offense. And Wilson for Denver has been better than he was last year. I would say he's been impressive so far, but I don't trust him to keep pace with this high powered offense for the Dolphins. And really, defensively for the Dolphins, I think they match up pretty nicely as well because they have Kader Kohu, who is one of the premier nickel corners in the NFL. He could shut down Jerry Jeudy, and Courtland Sutton is going to have his hands full with Xavier Howard. So I think the Dolphins match up favorably on both sides of the ball, and I think they also just clearly have the better quarterback at this point, even if Wilson is playing at a much higher level than he was in recent memory. To put it bluntly, the Ravens are just a much better team than the Colts. I don't know if there's any real positional group that the Colts are favorable to the Ravens at, except for maybe the defensive line, but even that is, I think, pretty arguable. So I think this is a pretty clear game. I think the Ravens are going to win. They're not going to have too much trouble with it either. This Patriots and Jets game is going to be so ugly, but I have a pretty strong leaning towards the Patriots because Zach Wilson is just a disaster at quarterback, and that is a really bad mix with a defensive genius in Bill Belichick, and also the fact that the Jets have a really poor offensive line against a pretty strong defensive line for the Patriots as well. So I think there's going to be so much pressure on Wilson, even if they're not going to be trying to pass too much. There's also just not going to be very much success on the ground for the Jets because the Patriots are going to realize that the Jets are going to try to run as much as they possibly can, and they're just not going to allow that because they have the correct scheme in place to stop the run, and they also have a lot of talent on the inside, especially with Christian Barmore, who is a sneaky good defensive tackle. I think he's a bit underrated at this point. He is one of the more exciting young defensive tackles in the NFL. And really, there's not going to be too much success against the edge as well because Judon and Uche are both solid run defenders as well. So I think the Patriots are really well set up to just completely lock down the Jets. And I think they'll be able to have some success, albeit very minimal success, in going against the Jets defense because the Jets have an elite defense as well. And the Patriots offense isn't very good in their own right, but I just trust Mac Jones a whole lot more than I do Zach Wilson. So I think offensively, the Patriots are going to have the edge there as well. I would also bet a unit on the Patriots minus 2.5 because they just need to win by a field goal at that point. And I think they're well equipped to do that because I can't see the Jets putting up basically any points in this game. CJ Stroud has been super impressive so far this season, but Trevor Lawrence is a bona fide elite quarterback with much more experience to his name than Stroud has so far. And really, the supporting cast for the Jags is just so much better than what the Texans have. So I think the Jags are going to win, and I don't think it'll be too close. I like Seattle versus Carolina because they check basically all the boxes. They have the better quarterback, they have the better weapons, they're also at home. So there's a lot to really go in their favor, and the Panthers just have basically no weapons to their name, and I think it's just going to be continually difficult for them to put up points, whereas the Seahawks are super loaded at wide receiver in particular, and I think they're just going to be able to put up points against basically anybody, and this Carolina defense is promising in some ways, but they're not great as a whole. So I think the Seahawks are really going to be able to attack. Kansas City versus Chicago. This one's really easy. One team has Patrick Mahomes, the other team has Justin Fields. Do I need to say anything more? Much like they've done all year, I think the Cowboys are going to continue to roll and just completely destroy the Cardinals. And really, it's as simple as the Cowboys are just a complete buzzsaw. They have basically no issues on their team. and the Cardinals have basically nothing but issues. The Steelers versus Raiders is probably the hardest game for me to predict this week because offensively for the Steelers, it's a stoppable force, meaning a movable object, where the Steelers' offense is about as ineffective as an NFL offense can possibly be. But then the Raiders have one of the worst defenses in the league as well. So I think in the end, the Steelers are going to be able to have some success passing the ball because really, as far as defensive backs go for the Raiders, there's Marcus Peters, who's solid. Nate Hobbs is also a good nickel corner. Then Trayvon Moehrig is pretty solid. He's had some ups and downs, but that's about it that you can really feel confident in. Everybody else is ripe for the pickings, and I think that George Pickens will be able to have some success against the weak defensive backs. I think Marcus Peters is going to be on him quite a bit just because size-wise that makes the most sense for the Raiders. And I think defensively, though, the Steelers are going to be able to have some success against the Raiders offense because Devontae Adams, one of the elite receivers in this league, definitely in the top 5 at the very least, probably top 3 more accurately. But then you have the issue of the offensive line for the Raiders is good, but I don't think it's good enough to keep up with TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith and Marcus Golden as a rotational guy as well. So I think the Steelers are going to have success getting pressure, and ultimately I lean that the Steelers are going to win, but more so I like betting a unit on the Steelers as a +3, buying that extra half a point. So that way, if they lose by a field goal, it's a push and nothing happens. But if the game is even closer than that, then the Steelers and your bet come through, which I think is very likely that this game ends up being a field goal type of game. So you could even buy the full point. And in which case, if this game does end up being a field goal type of game, which I think is very reasonable, then you get the bet that way. I like the Eagles versus the Bucks because there is some growing optimism with Baker Mayfield. He has really been a breath of fresh air for the Buccaneers this year. He has been far better than I think anyone would have expected him to be. But do you really trust him in a likely high-scoring game against Jalen Hurts and the Eagles? I don't. And I especially don't because the Eagles still have a dominant defensive line that can get after you in just wave after wave of elite pass rushers. And the tackle situation has been pretty good for the Buccaneers. Tristan Wirfs is elite, and Luke Goedeke has actually been pretty solid this year, which is a bit surprising because he really struggled last season. But Baker Mayfield is a completely different quarterback when he's pressured than when he's kept clean. And this defensive line for the Eagles is good enough to pressure just about any offensive line. So I think that Mayfield is really going to have some struggles because he's just not going to be able to have clean pockets like he's been having to this point in this season. He's really going to have to struggle, and I think that's going to be enough for the Eagles to win because Hurts, on the other hand, is probably going to have pretty clean pockets for the most part. The Eagles have a top 2 at a minimum offensive line in the league. I would say it's still probably the best in the entire NFL. And the Buccaneers have a solid pass rush, but it's nothing compared to what the Eagles have. So I think that the Eagles are really going to be able to control the trenches like they have become accustomed to. And I think that Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown are really going to be able to have their way against even solid coverage from the Buccaneers. To put it simply, if Joe Burrow plays, I like the Bengals. If not, the Rams are going to win. I don't think there's too much of an explanation needed for the Rams winning if Joe Burrow doesn't play. That's one of the best quarterbacks in the entire NFL not playing. But for the Bengals, even though they're 0-2, I think they're a whole lot better than that record would suggest. And I think they present a difficult matchup for the Rams because Darian Kendrick is really, really not good as a corner. And in addition to that, there's also Kobe Durant, who is a weak corner as well. So there are multiple players that can be attacked in the passing offense for the Bengals, and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are going to be all over them. Ahkello Witherspoon is solid, but when he is your best corner and you're going against a top 3 wide receiver duo in the entire NFL, that's a pretty rough matchup. And I think that alone is really going to be enough for the Bengals to win. But also, the Bengals have a really solid defense too. They may not have shined as much as you would hope in their 0-2 start, but they definitely have the talent, and they also have the coordinating as well. So I think they'll be able to slow down this sort of surprising makeshift offense the Rams have thrown together